Hi, my name's William Cobbing'in. I'm an artist living in London, and I work between my small ceramic studio at home and my video studio in Hackney Wick. I have been really interested in art since I was a kid. I guess my mum really got me into ceramics. She had a small pottery studio at the house and I messed about in that. Later on, after school, I did a foundation course in art at St Martin's up at Smithfield Market in the middle of London, which was a total revelation. The idea of doing art every single day, being really committed, being surrounded by young artists, trying out loads of different techniques from fashion to graphic design to performance to sculpture. And I guess from then my interest in sculpture was really forged, and from the foundation I did a degree at Central St Martin's in Charing Cross Road and really delved into the world of sculpture and really pushed that over the 3 years. At the end of that period, I suppose I took a little bit of a sideways turn, and so I visited a student who'd been at St Martin's a couple of years before at an art school called De Ateliers in Amsterdam. And I was so blown away by that art school that I decided to do my master's there. Worked there, and that was slightly where my interest in performance started. So I made a lot of prosthetic sculptures and sculptures that people could wear. And the idea of a link between sculpture and the body that's moving, and how to link sculpture and the body to the world around us took shape. But then also the idea of performance and slapstick and humour, and maybe even the idea of the absurd. But the idea of mixing those two disparate things seemed to really work for me in those early stages. Also another sort of a side project in ceramics, which is my series called Cover Version. And it really, put quite simply, is a series of covers of books that I really love. So what I've done is I've created templates of the typography and the text that go on the book cover, and I press that into clay and make these kind of, I don't know, things that look like almost sort of ancient ceramic tablets, as if they've got a cuneiform text and characters pressed into them, and then I glaze those. But also, it's also very sort of passionately about a love of books that I have as well. So, and the idea of making them into ceramic, making them sort of impenetrable, but also, making them incredibly sort of solid as well. The idea of maybe sort of concealed knowledge within that, half an inch thick of a clay. Over the course of my art career, the type of artwork I've made it's a sort of strange paradox. Formally it's often been quite different, and conceptually it's often been quite different, but it does also coalesce around this idea of the physical, the performative, the idea of making but also moving, the idea of a sculpture that's maybe kinetic or that doesn't sit still. One of the ways I work through ideas for performance or sculpture is often through drawing. That's often in the form of quite a kind of a quick sketch. I can't normally just think of a work and then just go straight into it. It's strangely the act of drawing, the idea of putting a pencil to paper, enables me to somehow extract the idea that's sort of floating around in the ether, or is somehow in my, at the back of my mind or something like that. The drawing enables that to come out. And I think even in the performance or in the sculpture, the idea of images is important. The idea of my sculptures are often created to be looked at from the front, whereas a lot of sculptures are considered more in the round. It's the idea of the face or the mask or something like that. More recently, I've returned to really to clay being the central facet of my work, and it really drives everything I do. So, and that includes sculptural objects, so small objects that really betray the a haptic impression, the idea of touch. It's very much that they're hand-sized and they're formed by the impressions of my hands and my fingers. In a way, sculpturally, that's what's always sort of driven me. And clay is really nice in that sense because it's obviously so responsive to touch, and it's such a sort of pliable, easy material. And no, there's something a little bit about clay which is almost like painting in space or something. It doesn't have the sort of obdurate, rigid resistance of say a stone or a bronze or something like that. It's so sort of easy and responsive to work with that you can create an image, a form of sort of imagery as well. That sort of materiality is very different once you get to working with clay and it's a finished static object and you're firing it and then glazing it. It has a whole sort of different sort of set of properties as well. I suppose, and the idea of glazes are something that as time goes by I'm increasingly becoming more and more in a way obsessed with trying to finesse those. I think anyone who works with glaze knows the idea about how obsessed you can get, in the sense of there are a million different permutations. I'm very sort of busy with that quite methodical way of working, and or almost scientific, the idea of testing out glaze recipes, slightly altering the ingredients, and then doing tests in the kiln and seeing how they work, or what happens if you layer one glaze on top of the other, or what happens if you put a glaze on a darker coloured clay or on a lighter coloured clay. So in terms of materiality, it's really challenging, but in a good way. I feel it's pushing my work forward in a conceptual way as well. I guess now with the sort of videos I do, which are since the pandemic have been these clay heads, and I cut them open and this brightly coloured paint comes out. Part of that is due to the absolute love I have for paint as a material, and the idea of being bombarded with colour, and the idea of colour sort of leaking or pouring or being unformed somehow, not necessarily being fixed. I mean, it's the defining thing about art, is how do people react to it, because that's perhaps the way in which an artwork is completed in terms of the idea of the encounter with the spectator. So some people really like the sort of splurging, cathartic colour of the paint liquid coming out of the clay face. But then some people object to, maybe they think it's crude, or and they think it's unnerving or uncanny or a bit sort of scary as well. And the fact that it's balanced between quite contradictory reactions, maybe there's something about that which for me is sort of interesting in it. Maybe that tells me I'm slightly on the right lines in terms of doing something if I'm causing quite a sort of sense of conflicting response. I think maybe at the heart of it, though, is that sculpture never leaves my practice at all. So with a performance, one way of looking at it is that it kind of gives life to a sculpture. And the sculpture has a life beyond. It's a sort of singular, fixed representation. It sort of means that the sculpture can move. But for me, there's something about materiality, about form, about kind of balance, or lots of sort of physical things that can come through in performance work as well. Certainly the idea of humour has always been important in my work. The idea of not necessarily an explicit joke, but the idea of an underlying kind of goofiness or a sort of sense of slapstick or deadpan or something like that, that part of it might be a reflection of feeling a sort of sense of awkwardness in the world. I like the idea that, a sort of Shakespearean idea of the jester always being the one that tells people the truths, because humour has a way of doing that. It gets under our skin, and the idea of a direct critique, a serious critique, might cause someone to feel sort of defensive, but humour allows us to explore potentially difficult, uncomfortable ideas and somehow allow it to maybe affect us a bit more. I guess for me, art is is a million different things, really. I guess one of the things it is about the expression of imagination. It's about the idea of creating something that's exciting or challenging visually. It's certainly about, taking risks and challenging yourself. I think some of the best art that gets made is the sort of least well understood, or is the stuff that's derided at the time. I think you need to really break convention. You need to do something that's strange or weird or at the periphery of culture.